be able to access it. So yes, what I'm going to be presenting here is a lot of new information, and it'll be about an hour and 15 minutes. So apologies that it's a bit long, but there's a lot of information. So in 2017, as Holger mentioned, I published a study arguing that the Lukan character Martha may be a 2nd century editorial interpolation into John's Gospel. The starting point for this discussion is demonstrable instability around Martha's presence in the oldest extant copy of John 11 and 12, Papyrus 66, where the name Maria has been corrected to Martha in John 11, verse 1. You can see that right here. One woman's name has been awkwardly crossed out and changed to say the sisters in verse 3. You can see that here, and the verbs are changed from singular to plural as well. And the dative feminine auti has been changed to the nominative feminine hauti through the addition of this hypodiastole, which we'll talk about in a moment. But you can see that in the first transcription, Jesus's quote sort of began here, and then this correction causes Jesus's quote to begin here. But Papyrus 66 is not the only manuscript displaying troubling corrections around Martha in the 4th Gospel. Martha's presence is inconsistent in dozens of manuscripts of John. Sometimes Mary is named first of those whom Jesus loved. And actually you have one in the Bibel Museum where this happens as well. 0233, majuscule 0233 has this reading where Mary is named first. In other manuscripts, Mary is the sister who first runs to Jesus. You can see here, this is interesting because it said Martha originally. There's the thetas. And then you can see that the theta was actually changed to an iota. So in this one, Mary runs to Jesus in John 11:20. In some manuscripts, Maria diakone in John 12, Mary is serving. And sometimes we even get Martha's name awkwardly added in the margin. Similar textual inconsistency around the Johannine Mary and Martha is found in the patristic record. For example, every extant manuscript of Tertullian's treatise against Praxeas, which is authored around 210 CE, states that Mary confessed Jesus as the Christ. That's not what John 11:27 says, of course, in our Bibles. Meanwhile, no comparable uncertainty is found around the sisters' names in the transmission of Luke 10. There is 0% from what I have found. This study also demonstrated that an alternate version of the opening verses of John 11 can be fully and sensibly reconstructed without Martha. That's on your handout, by using real readings from just 3 weighty manuscripts: Codex Alexandrinus, Papyrus 66, and Codex Colbertinus. You can see that this is a perfectly sensible text form. This alternative, sensible, eclectic text form raises the question of whether the Lukan character Martha was editorially interpolated into John 11 and 12 at a very early stage of the textual transmission. My article also suggested that the following 5 criteria can be used to catalog a problem around Martha. A, the unexpected omission of Martha's name. B, the initially transcribed Mary altered to Martha. C, the name Mary appearing instead of an expected Martha. D, an unexpected singular noun, verb, or pronoun describing the Bethany sisters. Or E, a different person named as first of those whom Jesus loved in John 11:5. So according to these criteria, I surveyed 175 Greek manuscripts, and approximately 20% of the Greek manuscripts have at least one of these issues, including, the one that we have in the Bibel Museum, because it's quite pervasive. Of 23 Old Latin witnesses of John that I surveyed, 30% contain problems around Martha's presence. And the issues occur in the entire Johannine textual transmission from Martha's arrival in John 11:1 to her exit in John 12:2. And I did survey 170 Greek and Latin manuscripts of Luke 10:38 to 42, and 0% had any confusion around the names Mary and Martha in the Lukan transmission. Since publishing this study, I have cataloged additional instability around Martha's presence in the Johannine transmission. It takes place not only in manuscripts of John and in the patristic record, but as I will show, in 3rd and 4th century artwork depicting the Lazarus episode, and some of those are on your handout as well. Today, I will present this additional evidence and address several recent publications that address evidence and responses to my study. These are from Piotr Jutkiewicz, I hope I'm saying his name right, Richard Fellows, Darrell Post, and Ally Kateusz. I will close with some recommendations for future research on this topic, as well as for the Nestle-Aland Committee on how the apparatus of Nestle-Aland 29 can best be updated to reflect these issues. So let's start with new readings from gospel manuscripts that I've dug up. So many Greek witnesses, as I've mentioned, do have these issues, and I was able to look at this one in person. This is minuscule 2616 that is held at Duke. And here the scribe has clearly changed the name Maria to Martha. You can see that there was an erased accent mark on the iota. The theta is very narrow and it is off center. When you compare it to the way Martha usually reads, you can see that the accent mark is supposed to be on the first syllable, and this little line is supposed to be on the second symbol, but not here. The line is on the first symbol, and it was Maria, changed to Martha. In minuscules 178, 989, and 2414, before it was corrected, Maria unexpectedly serves the supper at 12:02. And I listed a few of those in my Harvard Theological Review article, but now there's a few more. The entire phrase "and Martha served" is omitted in minuscule 2174, and the woman's name is absent in lectionary 5. But my data has probably just barely scratched the surface. Darrell Post has a new publication, and he says that he has collated 2,221 Greek manuscripts of John 11 and 12, and he has apparently found several other manuscripts demonstrating inconsistency around the Bethany sisters. And he hasn't published his collation yet. He just talks about it, and I will address his findings later in the presentation. Now there's new Coptic manuscript readings. Just as in Family 1 and Family 13, many Sahidic Coptic manuscripts list Mary first in John 11, verse 5, with the reading Mary and Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. Mary was almost certainly listed first at 11:5 in the Coptic diglot Papyrus 6. Its lacunose text reads "and Martha," probably both the Greek and the Latin sides, but it's wholly lacunose on the Greek side. And the Coptic side says just "and Martha." So probably Mary was first in that 4th century manuscript. Although it may be a simple didactic error, Sahidic Coptic manuscript 5 has this notable correction right here, where the word Marie was changed to Martha in scribendo. Okay, so it does say Mary and Maria, and then it's changed to theta. Perhaps that one's just a mistake. We also have Ge'ez witnesses. I don't read Ge'ez, I guess Holger does. But many Ge'ez gospel manuscripts list Mary first in 11:5 as well. The reading Mary and her sister and Lazarus is found, well, you can look right here at all of them. I don't want to take too much time listing them. But you can see that Mary's listed first in many, many copies. And in John 11:19, the expected order of Martha and Mary's names has been reversed in many manuscripts. And in John 11, verse 19, Duke Ethiopic Manuscript 5 says, "to console Mary about their brother." So it's a bit nonsensical. And you can see here, this is Duke Greek Manuscript 5. I went with Gay Byron, who passed away, which is very, very sad, but she lended her expertise to me, and we were able to look, and she right now is in this picture is pointing at the word Mary. Yes, for those of you who can read Ge'ez. And then in verse 1145, Martha's name is often added in the Ethiopic manuscripts. So I'm grateful to Gay Byron and also to Kurt Nickham for their expertise in helping me decipher these manuscripts. Also, the commentary manuscripts. So there's several commentary manuscripts of John containing inconsistencies around the sisters. Minuscule 742 is a 15th century manuscript of Theophylact's commentary on John, and Mary's name has been omitted from the gospel text at 1128. Usually it says that that Martha called her sister Mary secretly, and usually Mary's name appears right here, but it doesn't appear actually in any of them. Darrell Post says that at least 10 of the Theophylact commentary manuscripts omit Mary's name in the gospel text. And what's very funny is that when Theophylact's commentary begins in this particular manuscript, you can see another funny in scribento correction where it was Maria, and there's like, whoops, and they just put a big theta around it and then added. So that's a very funny one. That's probably my favorite one. So I would like to know what the other Theophylact commentaries read right after 1128. I'd be curious if any of them say Maria there. So those are the gospel manuscripts that I have cataloged, and now we have some more in the patristic record. I found striking patristic citations concerning the Bethany sisters. So there's a pseudo-Chrysostomic manuscript called In Lazarus 1. This homily is preserved in both Greek and Latin. It was first published by Henry Saville in 1612 in Greek, and his transcription is apparently based on manuscript Regio Lut, probably held at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in the 17th century. This homily also appears as part of the Spuria section of Bernard de Montfaucon's 11th volume on John Chrysostom, which was first published in 1734 and reprinted in Ming's Patrologia Graeca, volume 66. So de Montfaucon gives his Latin source as emendata ad fidem cod manuscripti Romani. So I think Pope Innocent allowed him to come to Rome and look at a bunch of manuscripts, and that's his source here, but that's all that we can tell, is that his Latin manuscripts come from Rome. So in many ways, this is a standard homily about the Lazarus episode where the pericope has been examined scene by scene. But when the homilist quotes John 11, verse 3, we diverge from the story by oddly providing the name of a single sister surrounded by multiple women. And there's discrepancy between the Greek and the Latin versions regarding this woman's name. The Greek woman says to imitate the women around Martha, tas peritin Marthan gunaikas. But the Latin focuses on Mary. It says imitate Mary and the women around her. Not only are the Greek, and then they say the quote, Lord, behold, the one you love is sick. So not only are the Greek and Latin versions divided in naming Martha versus Mary here in John 11, verse 3, they are also differing in whether they're emphasizing the group of women or the single sister and the women around her. And of course, this is the verse, John 11, verse 3, where one woman is named in Papyrus 66 before her name is crossed out. The homilist continues and describes the Lazarus episode and directly quotes the text of verses 4, 11, 12, 15, 21, 23, 24, 25, 34, 37, and 39, all in order. Then Martha, it just summarizes that Martha confesses and fetches her sister, but it doesn't quote the verses. Then oddly, Jesus's prayer to the Father is quoted here, right? Father, I thank you because you've heard me, right? But then the quote, I know that whatever you ask of God, he will give to you. It has been shifted to a different point in the narrative. Now, instead of happening in the theological dialogue with Martha earlier, it's moved to the middle of Jesus's prayer. Not only that, but both Martha and Mary say it. We know that whatever you ask of God, he will give to you. This is usually spoken by Martha in verse 11:22, but it has been moved forward in the narrative to interrupt Jesus's prayer, and both Mary and Martha say it. So the Bethany sisters' presentation in this homily is unexpected, particularly in its citations of the text of John 11:3 and 11:22, and the interruption of John 11:41. Not only is the sister named, but both the Greek and Latin versions, in John 11:3, I should say, but the Greek and Latin versions are inconsistent with one another. And in the quotation of John 11:22, it is spoken by both sisters. I suspect that the unexpected choices in this homily and its copies reflect encounters with different text forms of John 11. Perhaps some where one sister's name is actually provided in John 11, verse 3, just as in Papyrus 66 before it was corrected. It's possible also that the record was divided on whether Martha or Mary was engaging in the theological dialogue with Jesus, which caused someone to move their quote forward to a scene in the Lazarus story where Jesus is speaking with both women. So now it's after the sisters are on the scene. So this is a strange homily. There's another one that is also pseudo-Chrysostomic, but also sometimes attributed to Hippolytus on the fourth day of Lazarus, number 2. We find another unexpected quotation of the Johannine text. This rendering of the story is found in both Greek and Latin, and it says, Where have you laid him? And Mary said, come and see, Lord. And Jesus wept. So it seems to be the lemma because it goes directly straight from Mary said, come and see, Lord, and Jesus wept. Since the homilist is including John 11:35 here, it's possible that he is citing a lengthy section of text from a manuscript where only Mary said the words, come and see, Lord. This one is actually Chrysostom. This is real Chrysostom. It's Chrysostom's homily 33 on the Holy Feast of Palms. So here we seem to find awareness from Chrysostom of multiple readings of who is doing the serving in John chapter 12. He includes the Lazarus episode as we would expect, with Martha serving. Here it is, He de Martha diakone, okay. But then he says, a wholly unexpected statement. Some say this took place in the house of another and that Mary served, for she was a disciple. And then he goes on to describe the Johannine scene. So unlike manuscript variants that can be chalked up to scribal error, here Chrysostom shows awareness of multiplicity in the tradition when he acknowledges that some say that Mary served. And it's the interesting explanation that she was a disciple. This homily demonstrates that Chrysostom may have seen some copies of the Johannine anointing scene, which included this phrase, Maria diakone, such as we've seen in some Byzantine copies. Even more strikingly, we find a nearly identical passage in his homily 65 on John. Some say this took place in the house of another, and Mary did not serve. It seems as though here Chrysostom has reused and slightly revised his material. You can see here that it says in her house, whereas before here it said in the house of Martha. So you can see there's a couple of little slight textual differences. They're mostly the same, but not quite the same. So he may have revised his text. Now, I admit it's possible that this word ou, perhaps that just fell out of the textual transmission of homily 33. So there are multiple explanations here, but we do also have gospel manuscripts where Mary serves. So his conflicting statements on whether Mary did or did not serve may also indicate his awareness of multiple readings in the manuscript, especially since others say, right? Now let's look at the Pilgrim Egeria. In the 4th century Journal of the Pilgrim Egeria, she describes her visit from Jerusalem to the town of Bethany. And she says, as they go from Jerusalem to the Lazarium, there's a church in the place where Maria, the sister of Lazarus, occurrit, where she met the Lord. Egeria uses the verb occurrit here, and that apparently references John 11:20. Here is the old Latin reading at John 11:20, rather than John 11:32, which has venicet, okay? So several Greek gospel manuscripts do read Maria at John 11, verse 20. And Egeria does not mention Martha anywhere in her reminiscences about Bethany. So it is possible that in the copy of John that Egeria knew, only Mary went to meet Jesus. So now let's talk about other publications and their responses to me. So I'm going to address people who like me and people who don't like me. So first, we're going to start with Piotr Jutkiewicz's study, Mary as a Disciple from Catholic Biblical Quarterly in 2022. He concludes, he talks about the unique translation of John 11 found in the 4th century Syriac Sinaitic palimpsest, which is a very idiosyncratic translation. Jutkiewicz concludes that the translator gave special emphasis to Mary of Bethany. He bases this finding on several unique readings in the palimpsest, but I'm just going to highlight 2 here for the purposes of time. In John 11:2, it says Mary washed Jesus's feet. The translator's choice of wash rather than wipe may be a direct reference. Jutkiewicz thinks it's a direct reference to the washing scenes in the healing of the blind man in John chapter 9 and the washing of the disciples' feet in John 13, which many other commenters have already noted that there's a parallel between Mary wiping Jesus's feet and Jesus washing the disciples' feet in John 13. In Jutkiewicz's view, this translational choice intentionally highlights Mary's prominence. And then at 1145, the Syriac Sinaitic palimpsest reads that many Jews came to Jesus because of Mary. This is rather than the expected they came to Mary and saw what he did. Jutkiewicz concludes that in the Johannine theology, it's normally the sign, that is, what Jesus did, that reveals who Jesus is and leads people to faith. But in the Syriac Sinaitic palimpsest, the important transformation is the omission of haepoesen. This omission does not eliminate the importance of the sign. It highlights the role of Mary in the process. Mary becomes an intermediary who enables others to come to Jesus and to believe in him. Jutkiewicz has shown here that in a very early Syriac-speaking Christian community, perhaps of the 3rd or the 4th century, Mary of Bethany was given an outsized role that affected the translator's choices. So this informs us that perhaps some communities had a particular veneration for Mary of Bethany. Next is Richard Fellows. This is a more substantial critique. So in his 2023 issue of TC, a Journal of Biblical Textual Criticism, Richard Fellows came to a different interpretation of much of the same data. He argues that the unusual textual variants around the names Mary and Martha are best explained as sexist editorial activity, attempting to diminish the roles of both women in the Lazarus episode. In my view, Fellows provides a few strong points, as well as several incorrect points and some misleading points. And he even overlooks some other evidence. So I'm going to survey these issues below. So first of all, this is I think it's his strongest point. He pays attention to a possible sexist tendency in the addition or the replacement of the pronoun autu in many copies of John 11:1, 11:3, and 11:5. He points out that in the majority of the manuscripts, Martha is introduced as Mary's sister in John 11:1. In John 11:1. And so this would have been surprising for early readers of the text, where people were usually defined by their relationship to a male relative. Consequently, the presence of a masculine pronoun at John 11:1, such as many manuscripts have here, Family 13 all have that, may reflect a sexist editorial tendency. Similarly, the addition of a masculine pronoun at John 11:3, like we see here, many manuscripts have that one as well, make good sense of the common reading the sisters sent to him, his sisters, Hai Adelphi Autu, sent to Jesus, saying, right? In my 2017 article, I had suggested that this was a conflate reading, but I think Fellows has persuaded me that in at least John 11, verse 3, these copies may add a personal pronoun to give more prominence to Lazarus. So I think he makes sense of the addition in John 11, verse 3, but I'm less persuaded that autes was always simply replaced by autu for reasons I will explain momentarily. He also makes a valid suggestion that sexism could be at the root of Lazarus being listed first in many Old Latin copies of John 11, verse 5, as well as the lemma of a Greek homily of a John Chrysostom homily. So this is from, it's one manuscript held at Mount Sinai, and I think it's widely known that Chrysostom's homilies were revised, the lemmas were revised to match the received text. And so when you see a lemma that says something different, it might be more likely to be what John Chrysostom actually wrote. And so this one differs from all other copies. And so this may well be what John Chrysostom's 4th century Greek copy said, Lazarus and his sisters. But this could be because of sexism, a desire to list Lazarus before his sisters. Fellows and others have highlighted the occasional tendency to transpose references to men above references to women in various New Testament lists. The best known example is the reversal of Priscilla and Aquila's name in some copies of Acts 18:26. Fellows has also shown that while sometimes males can be demoted, women are 5 times more likely to be demoted than men. This may well have been a motivation for a change of the name order, but we should not automatically assume that the unexpected appearance of a man first is a diminishment of the women. Fellows' proposal does not explain why Mary, rather than Martha, is so often appearing at the top of the list in John 11:5 in manuscripts such as the F13, Family 13, the Ge'ez manuscripts where Mary is listed first in John 11:5, the Coptic manuscripts where Mary is listed first in John 11:5, and of course the many, I can go all the way back here, but there's Family 13 and Family 1 also have many of them as well. So returning to what we were saying here, if I can find my spot. Sorry, I have lots of slides. Okay. So it is possible that this is a sexist editorial change, but it could also be because of Johannan's style. So I'm going to talk about that in a moment as well. So here's some of the misleading arguments that he makes, and the peer reviewers really should have caught this. More troubling is his explanation of Martha's absence in the first transcription of John 11:1 in Codex Alexandrinus. Now, as you'll see from your handout, the first transcription of Codex Alexandrinus is a sensible reading. There was a certain sick man, Lazarus of Bethany, from the village of Mary, his sister. And so what he thinks is that he says, Alexandrinus may have had a tendency to omit female names, for it omits Prisca and Persis. But the examples that Fellows is making this point by are obvious parablepses. The repeated greeting aspazontai humas appears at the beginning of 1 Corinthians 16:19 and 1 Corinthians 16:20. Aspazate appears at the beginning of Romans 16:12b and 16:13. Due to parablepsis, the entirety of 1 Corinthians 16:9 is gone, including any mention of Aquila or the churches of Asia. And the entire second half of Romans 16:12 is totally omitted. Prisca and Persis are not the targets. And Fellows is well aware that these may be parablepses because he said so explicitly in a 2022 article, but he does not share this information with the readers of his 2023 article. And I do not know why the peer reviewers didn't catch that. I also want to emphasize that this reading Marias tes adelphes autou in the first hand of Codex Alexandrinus is not a parablepsis, and it is not a singular reading. The very same words are found in the first hand of Papyrus 66, whose scribe also added Martha to the text by way of correction in a slightly different way. Whatever's going on in Codex Alexandrinus, it is not the simple change of two letters that we do see. We sometimes do see Marias kai Marthas tes adelphes autou. In this case, I could see a sexist change from just the two letters eta sigma to omicron upsilon. That's just a two-letter change. But that's not what this is. This was Marias tes adelphes autou, and that is a sensible reading. So what he's suggesting is that you would have to, that this scribe would have had to first omit a woman's name and then change the pronoun. That's a very complicated change. And so he doesn't really explicitly say that in his article. And I think that this was something that the peer reviewers should have caught. But I'm addressing it now. So another issue is that he suggests that it is scribes that is changing the text here. He says, well, it was common for scribes to create variants that promoted men over women. The reverse was rare. So it is highly unlikely that of Mary, his sister, would have given rise to of Martha and her sister. But my argument is not talking about scribes. I am talking about an editor interpolating the Lukan character Martha into the text of John, which would have required many substantive changes around Mary, including the duplication of John 11:21 and 11:32, where both sisters say, Lord, if you'd been here, my brother would not have died. It would have also involved the wholesale composition of John 11, verse 28, where the sisters speak to one another. So I'm not talking about a scribe copying and making the little changes. I'm talking about an editor revising the chapter. The interpolation of the new character Martha would quite sensibly alter the reading of Mary, his sister, to of Mary and Martha, her sister. And that could just as well explain the confusion around the gender of the pronoun. So these are two. So he's making a scribal argument and I'm making an editorial argument. All right. He has also overlooked Johannine scholarship. He seems not aware of broader conversations around the redaction critical observation that John 11:1 seems to have been composed by a different hand than John 11:5, because the order of names is different. In John 11:1, there was a certain sick man, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and Martha. Verses 11:5, Jesus loved Martha and her sister, unnamed, and Lazarus, right? John P. Meyer writes in his second volume of A Marginal Jew, it is remarkable that while Mary was named before Martha in verse 1, in 11:5, not only is Martha placed first, but Mary's not even named, although Lazarus as well as Martha are. And this is an interesting observation from John Meyer. In 1994, he said, the Lukan story of Martha and Mary has no Lazarus, and apparently the early Johannine form of the Lazarus story had no Martha. This was a redaction critical observation. He wasn't looking at the manuscripts. Now, much redaction critical ink has been spilled over trying to figure out the sources, so I'm not going to go into that, but there's many, Robert Fortna, Urban von Walde, there's many people who've tried to reconstruct the text. But it will suffice simply to note that several Johannine specialists conclude that the differing order of names between John 11:1 and John 11:5 betray different redactional hands. In my view, the presence of Martha at the top of the list in John 11:5 is not so much a desire to denigrate Mary, as Fellows suggests. I think it is a later editorial desire to override Johannine style by focusing the reader's attention squarely upon Martha in verse 5. Another interesting observation has been made by Johannine scholar Ingrid Rosa Kitzberger. In her 2019 monograph, Interfigural Readings of the Gospel of John, she writes that Jesus reminds Martha, he said to her, did I not tell you that if you would believe, you would see the glory of God? This is verse 40, right after she said the tomb stank. No, he did not, the reader might answer, or at least the narrator never mentioned it. Only the reader knows that Lazarus's illness is not unto death, it is for the glory of God. Right? Supposedly. Kitzberger is calling the reader's attention to a strange inconsistency in the Johannine narrative. But what if Jesus did tell Lazarus's sister about the glory of God? In fact, this is the reading of Papyrus 66 at John 11:3 and John 11:4. The scribe first copied a version of the story where Lazarus had only one sister. Her name is erased, of course. Via a large space after this word, alpha upsilon tau eta, in 11:4, the scribe indicates that Jesus spoke to her, and you can see it quite clearly. Let's see here. Acusas de ho Jesus epen aute. When Jesus heard, he said to her, and then there is a space, and then he astheni, the sickness is not unto death. All right. So it seems that the first transcription, remember, this was right after only one woman was copied. But then the woman gets split in two, and it doesn't work anymore to say that Jesus said something to her. So the scribe adds this hypodiastole, it's like a comma that is forcing a break between the words apen and aute, so that now, the scribe has changed the words of Jesus, by the way. Now this is one of Jesus's words. Haute he asthenia. This sickness is not unto death. Okay? So what this means is that Jesus's message about the glory of God was not just communicated to the reader or to the disciples. The message was given to the sister of Lazarus about the glory of God. This dative feminine singular aute in John 11:4 makes better sense of Jesus's comment in John 11:40. He might be referencing his previous conversation with the one woman in John 11:3 and 4, the same woman who now complains in John 11:39 that the tomb stinks. Returning to Fellows, he does make a reasonable critique of my argument regarding the nonsense reading in Papyrus 66 at John 11, verse 1. He says, Schrader's theory does not easily explain the text of Papyrus 66, Marias kai Marias tes adelphes autu, Mary and Mary, his sister. It requires that the words kai Marias were added, but it does not explain how this could have happened. And I'm happy to clarify my position on the matter. It is widely accepted that the scribe of Papyrus 66 had access to two exemplars of John, one that the scribe copied from and one that the scribe corrected against. My current position is that one of these exemplars had a story with only Lazarus and Mary. This is exemplar one that I'm suggesting here on the left. And the text presented on the right is what our nestle-aland text has, where there are Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. So the scribe has two text forms in front of him. one with Lazarus and Mary, one with Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. And I suggest at the outset of copying the Lazarus episode, the scribe glanced at the two exemplars and knew that the copies diverged from one another. So the scribe creatively attempted sort of a middle way by creating a combination reading. There was a certain man, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary, and Mary, his sister. So here he's being faithful to exemplar 1 in only naming Mary, and being faithful to exemplar 2 in mentioning 2 sisters. Rather than choosing between these obviously different versions, the scribe attempted an intermediate reading. Although it was a good try, it resulted in a nonsense reading. So the scribe has corrected it to the text of exemplar 2. But then at John 11:3 and 4, I think that the scribe preferred exemplar 1. And so we get, therefore Mary sent to him saying, Lord, behold, the one you love is ill. When Jesus heard, he said to her, this sickness is not unto death. All right, so the scribe is now favoring exemplar 1. But the scribe seems to have deliberated quite a bit when he got to John 11, verse 5. In this verse, the 2 exemplars reflect 2 totally different names. So if we go here, this one has Jesus loved Lazarus and his sister, which we do have in one old Latin copy. And the nestle-aland text says Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, right? So the scribe has to choose. Is he going to write the word Lazarus or is he going to write the word Martha? He can't, it's not so simple as an iota and a theta anymore. So when we get to John 11, verse 5, the scribe actually deliberated quite a bit because after he says the glory of God, to glorify the Son through it, he stops. Look, he stops once, and then he stops again. Then he writes one letter, and then he stops again. Maybe he had to go to the bathroom. It was a long time ago. We don't know. But it is also possible that these stops reflect the exact moment when, after much deliberation, the scribe has decided to abandon exemplar 1, been copying from exemplar 1 and correcting against exemplar 2, but now he's going to switch them. Now exemplar 2 is his favorite exemplar, and now Martha shows up in the base text for the first time. Before this, Martha was only in the text by way of correction. This is also likely the moment when the scribe has gone back to scratch out the woman's name in John 11:3 and to split her in 2. And that required changing the verbs from singular to plural, and also the addition of the hypodiastole in John 11, verse 4, ensuring that the ambiguous word haute would be interpreted as haute in the nominative. So when the scribe stops right here, stop, stop, stop. Am I going to say Lazarus? Am I going to say Martha? I'm going to go back. So the scribe changes this, adds the iota there to make legusa plural, adds the hypodiastole so that this word doesn't mean to her, and then continues on transcribing John 11, verse 5 with Martha there first in the list. So from here on, the scribe relied on exemplar 2, resulting in a text where Martha is present throughout the remainder of John 11 and 12. This photograph you are looking at may capture a defining moment in the transmission of John's gospel. The scribe of Papyrus 66 knew both text forms, but eventually cautiously opted to retain rather than to omit important information about Martha. This image may provide a window onto the Ausgangstext in action, when the one sister text form of the Lazarus story is being set aside in favor of the fuller two sister text form. Okay. We don't usually get photographs of the Ausgangstext, but I like that idea. All right, so now let's go to another critic, Darrell Post. Rescuing Martha, very chivalrous, a response to Elizabeth Schrader Polczer. In a recent Bible and Spade magazine article entitled Rescuing Martha, Darrell Post discusses his conclusions after undertaking a very impressive task of collating 2,221 Greek manuscripts of John 11 and 12. Bible and Spade is a magazine published by the Associates for Biblical Research, which is a self-described Christian apologetics ministry. In this article, Post makes the case that my work has simply highlighted a number of scribal blunders throughout the Johannine textual transmission. For instance, he writes, Maria and Martha are each mentioned 9 times in 11:1 to 12:3, and the story switches back and forth between the two. So one should expect scribes to sometimes wrongly write Maria for Martha or vice versa. Now, of course, Martha and Maria are each mentioned multiple times in Luke 10:38 to 42, and the story switches back and forth between Maria and Martha in Luke 10. So we should expect scribes to mix up their names in the Lukan transmission as well, but they do not. Post thinks that these are just scribal mistakes, not memories of an original text replaced in the 2nd century. But since Post has not surveyed the textual transmission of Luke 10, he has no control study by which to demonstrate that these discrepancies are simply mistakes. There are some other problems with Post's argument. At several points in his article, he suggests that the Greek majority text is to be preferred. He writes, both Maria and Martha are named correctly in nearly every one of the 2,221 manuscripts checked. Fellows does the same thing, by the way. He wrote that the list of names where Martha appeared first in John 11:5 is certainly the initial text, for it is supported by almost all of the Greek manuscripts. Obviously, very few textual critics would agree or think that the long ending mark or the pericope of the adulteress or the angel at the pool are the initial text based on their being present in most manuscripts. Both Post and Fellows seem unaware of the text critical maxim that manuscripts should be weighed, not counted. Neither of them has a PhD in biblical studies, so that might be a factor. I'm not sure. Post does provide an interesting set of data around the erased name in John 11:3, though, and this is important. So he examines the transcription of Mary and Martha's names throughout John 11 and 12, and he examines the space between the rho and the alpha in each instance. Post argues that because the space between the rho and the alpha of the woman's name is rather wide in John 11, verse 3, the name Martha is more likely to have been transcribed. You can see his spacings here. But this chart is incomplete. In fact, there are many examples in Papyrus 66 where the scribe leaves a great deal of space between letters. And so I gave some examples here where in Papyrus 66, the scribe leaves wide spaces when transcribing the specific pattern of letters alpha, rho, iota. Each example is a screenshot that's taken at the exact same resolution from the New Testament Virtual Manuscript Room. I have purposely not adjusted these images in any way, which is why they're sort of awkward. This first vertical line is aligned directly through the middle of the row in every single instance. And then the second vertical line I have put through the middle of the alpha. And you can see here that if the scribe originally wrote Maria at John 11, verse 3, like if there was an iota in here, the spacing between the letters is not usual, but it's not remarkable. More problematically, Post does not include a highly relevant example from John 20, where the name Maria is transcribed, and you can see that the iota has a lot of space before the theta. Now, in this instance, you can see I've got 2 photographs here. It's because I wanted to provide all the same resolution, and these are from the photographs taken from the 1950s. And so this is the resolution, and you can see here, this is a loose leaf, so it's got a nice, pretty color picture. And you can see, but I did have to adjust the spacing on this second one. So I just wanted you to have a very clear picture of how similar, if you can write the word Maria, and the alpha will end up in about the same place as here in John 11:3. So if the scribe originally wrote Maria at John 11:3, again, these other examples show that it's quite common. And you can also see how different the image looks when the lighting is better here, right? When you compare John 11:3 to 11:1, it's quite similar, which makes me wonder, could the scribe have written Maria then Martha? Or Martha then Maria, and then High Adelphi? These are all possibilities of what happened here. This is our best picture that we have of it, unfortunately. So in sum, the wider spacing at John 11:3 is not enough to conclude that Martha was the erased name. Post himself writes, Schrader Polczer concedes that it is impossible to tell what was written at John 11:3, and I agree. Now, since publishing this article, just last month on the ETC blog, Post has argued more forcefully for the reading Martha. Here he actually makes a cool little video toggle that I'm not smart enough to figure out how to put that into my PowerPoint. But he basically puts these two images next to each other. And what he's done is a video graphic where he takes the shape of a theta of Martha's name from John 11:30, and he sort of removes the outline of this theta from here and shows what it would have looked like without the theta. And he says the back and forth action between these two images enables one to see the place where the theta crossbar started. I think he thinks that this is the theta crossbar. Several portions of the forward slanting oval are clearly visible. So he's saying it must be Martha's name that was there. But this is again problematic. To begin with, there are two different images of Papyrus 66 posted on the virtual manuscript room. And he has inexplicably chosen the darker image rather than the lighter image to create his graphic. You can see the difference. This is the darker image on the NT in the New Testament virtual manuscript room, and this is the lighter image, but he chose the darker one. And the lighter image reveals that there is not a particularly flat top to the phi, nor are we certain to see traces of a theta. I think he thinks that this is what the theta is. But a wider view of this section of the page in the lighter photograph demonstrates the traces are just like several other dark spots on the papyrus. Like, what trace of a letter is this one? What trace of a letter is this one? In fact, this looks like it's the papyrus fiber right here. And so that could be affecting the shading. He says, I would be guilty of irresponsible bias to affirm. In his Bible and Spade article, he wrote, I would be guilty of irresponsible bias to affirm that what the scribe first wrote was presumably Martha. But then he tries to maybe have this irresponsible bias in his ETC blog post. I just wanted you to see a bigger picture here so you really have it in front of you. So I think he thinks that this is the trace of the theta right here. But when you pull back, what is that? What is this? What is this? This is, the papyrus surface is uneven and the papyrus fiber is creating some shading here. It's just as possible that an iota was erased here. Or iota then theta or theta then iota. We don't know unless somebody can break into the Bodmer. Don't break into the Bodmer, but unless somebody can get the Bodmer library to open up the codex and digitize it, which they have to rehumidify it, and they're terrified that they're going to destroy the papyrus when they open it up again. So this is why we don't have better pictures. But maybe down the line we'll have hyperspectral imaging that will help us here. But until then, we cannot know. So the main thing that I think Post has done that I like, that is interesting to me, is that he has uncovered much additional evidence of instability around the women's names. He's convinced that these are just scribal errors, but in John 11:39, he has found Greek manuscripts that say that Mary said the tomb stank. I didn't know about that. I only found patristic quotations before from John Chrysostom and Cyril of Jerusalem, but now he has gospel manuscripts that say so. And he's found other manuscripts of John 11:20, where Mary went to Jesus and sat in the house, which is sort of nonsensical, but it does say that Mary runs to meet him. And then John 12:2, he talks about some more manuscripts where Mary is serving. He says, these are simply mistakes. Perhaps so. But from John Chrysostom's 33rd homily on the Holy Feast of Palms, it does seem that the manuscripts where Mary serves in 12:2, some of these were known as far back as the 4th century. So certainly we can all look forward to the publication of Post's complete collation, and I hope it will eventually also be supplemented by a collation of Luke 10:38 to 42, or any other comparanda that anybody can think of that would be appropriate, so that we can know what are just mistakes versus what is unique to the transmission of John. Post also comments on the findings. This one is also important. He talks about the stability of the text in John 11:28 to John 11:32. He says, for my theory to work, the later editors must have added verses 28 to 29. I don't have a problem with that. Yes, I do think the text would have had to be edited there. They involve direct dialogue between the two sisters. Every manuscript I have checked includes these verses. All the manuscripts in my study include verse 32. What about verses 30 and 31? He doesn't say anything about those. He does make an important point here because John 11:28, if it were composed by the interpolator and it's interacting in the textual transmission, we might expect sort of a patchwork of textual issues. Like in the angel at the pool in John 5:3b and 4, you see strange patchworks of readings, and maybe we would expect something happening there. And I think this is one of his strongest points. So again, we need to look forward to his collation and see which readings are actually there and which are gone. So he concludes the article with a puzzling comment that it is a speculative idea that there was serious conflict between Peter and Mary Magdalene. Post shows that he is not familiar with well-established controversy around a woman named Mary and her leadership or discipleship in the first centuries of Christianity. His comment again reflects the dangers of studying New Testament textual criticism without adequate training in early Christianity. We need to know all of the debates that were happening in the second, third, fourth, fifth centuries to understand the readings that we're confronted with in the transmission. Very early controversy around Mary is clearly demonstrated in the Gospel of Mary, which survives in 2 Greek copies and 1 Coptic copy of the 5th century, and the Greek copies are 3rd century. And we may now have another copy of the Gospel of Mary. Papyrus Oxyrhynchus 5577 looks like a 4th century copy that could be part of the missing vision section in the Gospel of Mary. So it circulated for several centuries. And of course, and this is where Peter seems quite jealous. He says, did he prefer Mary to us? And Levi says, if the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Of course, the Gospel of Thomas, Logion 114, many think that this was added a bit later because it's the last one, and it conflicts with some of the presentation of understandings of gender in Logion 22. So many people think that Logion 114 is a later edition. Simon Peter says, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life, right? So that seems to be a conflict between Peter and Mary. And then Jesus says the funny comment that he will make her male. That's fascinating. Of course, the Gospel of Philip, also found in Nag Hammadi Codex 2. So the Gospel of Thomas, we have 3 Greek copies of it from the 3rd century and 1 Coptic copy from the 5th century. But the Coptic copy is the only one that has this logion in it. The Gospel of Philip is in that same 5th century copy, but it's usually thought to have been authored in the 2nd century, like the Gospel of Thomas. And it says the companion of the Lord was Mary Magdalene, used to kiss her often. The rest of the disciples said, why do you love her more than all of us? So they're jealous. And the Savior says, why do I not love you like her? And he basically says that they are blind and that she sees. And then there's the Pistis Sophia, which survives, I think the copy is quite late, 6th or 7th century, I was told. But it was probably authored in the 3rd or 4th century. And Peter says, my Lord, we are not able to suffer this woman who takes the opportunity from us and does not allow any one of us to speak. And she speaks many times. And then Mary Magdalene says, my Lord, I understand all the time, but I'm afraid of Peter because he threatens me and he hates our kind. So the extant manuscripts of these texts were found in different locations, indicating independent attestation, and they were copied over the course of several centuries from the 3rd to perhaps the 7th century. So this widespread conflict has now been well established in Nag Hammadi studies, especially in the work of Antti Marjanen, Silke Petersen, Erica Mori, and Anne Graham Brock, and monographs devoted to the Gospel of Mary, Anne Pasquier, Karen King, Christopher Tuckett, Esther de Boer, and Sarah Parkhouse. This is a well-documented conversation in Nag Hammadi and Gnosticism studies. And there is no Gospel of Martha, perhaps because this Lukan character generated little controversy in antiquity. But obviously Mary did generate controversy. And this must be kept front and center as we're looking at these variants in John 11. So it's possible that Martha was seen as a more suitable carrier of the fourth evangelist's central thesis statement in John 11:27, precisely because of this controversy around Mary. In my view, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Pistis Sophia collectively provide a credible 2nd century Sitz im Leben for why Martha would have been added to the Lazarus story. especially if in some copies the controversial character Mary, unlike Peter, was the Christological confessor. Okay, Peter, of course, is the confessor in the Synoptics. All right, I'm going to look at one more article. Sorry, I know it's long, but we're going to get there. Okay, so this is Ally Kateusz. I did dig up a bit of ancient artwork, but Ally Kateusz basically documented it all. So we'll just talk about what she presents. So in an article published just last month in Ancient Jew Review, Ally Kateusz presents a great deal of evidence surrounding early artistic renditions of the Lazarus story. And she writes, we see solely one sister at the raising of Lazarus in a variety of media, in a variety of artistic styles, and regardless of the level of detail on the piece or of the amount of space available. You can see there's plenty of space here. You could have put a second sister, but they chose not to. I also am interested in the differences in the iconography. These are three different artists portraying the story in different ways, and these are all 4th century, and all of them choose to only have one sister. Kateusz concludes that 96% of the 3rd and 4th century scenes that have a sister with Jesus portray only one sister at the raising of Lazarus. So these are just a few of the dozens of works. I actually have an extra one at the bottom in the middle on your handout. That one Kateusz does not have, but so there's so many. I mean, we could spend all day looking at, there's like 100 of them that we could look at. This shows us that iconography of the Lazarus scene particularly flourished in the 4th century, and it was especially popular on sarcophagi. Kateusz says that a sister is depicted in approximately 4/5 of the sarcophagi that has the Lazarus scene. Now here, the best comparanda are depictions of what's called the water miracle from the Passio Petri. Has anybody heard of this? People who study like the Acts of Peter. It's quite obscure, but it was apparently a story that was known probably by oral tradition, where Peter prayed while in jail and he produced a spring and a marvelous sign of the cross, and it caused water to pour out, and then he baptizes his 2 prison guards, whose names are Processus and Martinian. The most important detail here is that 2 named men are present in the story. Kateusz writes that the sarcophagus scenes virtually always include, here they are, 2 small jailers with round hats. They're so cute. There they are again, 2 small jailers with round hats. Now, when I got to go to Rome this summer, which I'll talk about in a moment, and I did find one example of a sarcophagus that has the scenes from the Passio Petri. Here's Peter getting arrested by his jailers, and then it removes it to just 1. So this demonstrates that figures could sometimes be removed or abbreviated, and they're depictions of these stories. So removal or abbreviation is one possibility for why the ancient depictions are only presenting 1 rather than 2. But Kateusz notes that sculptors often paired the scenes of Lazarus and the jailers. So it turns out that always when the Lazarus scene is there, there's always 2 jailers. So here we find an even clearer data point in a couple of sarcophagi now. So you can see right here, there's only 1 sister, but 2 jailers here. 1 sister, 2 jailers. This is the sarcophagus of Sabinus at the Vatican Museum. And let's also look here at the 4th century sarcophagus of Marcus Claudianus, which is very similar to the sarcophagus of Sabinus. So in these depictions, scholars other than myself and Ally Kateusz have noted that there is a particular attention to symmetry. Here is what scholar Mont Allen writes. Look for a moment at the 2 scenes placed at extreme left and right, the 2 scenes chosen to bookend the other miracles. Mary kneels at the bottom right corner, so do the jailers at the bottom left. So we've got both kneeling. Above them are Christ and Peter, arrayed as mirror images of one another. There's something sort of theological there, right? Sorry, my page is having trouble coming apart. Come apart, page. So similarly Christ and Peter clasp their garments in their left hands, similarly raising their wands in their right hands to strike walls from which something life-given or given life similarly emerges. Would not a sculptor who's so concerned to show symmetry even into which hand the wand is going and holding the clothing, wouldn't he also wish to show symmetry with the two named sisters of Lazarus mirroring the two named jailers? But the sculptors of these sarcophagi found it most appropriate to only carve one sister in the depiction of the Lazarus episode, which may reflect their awareness of only one sister in the story they knew about Lazarus. Kateusz also discusses catacomb paintings, particularly two 3rd century frescoes depicting the Lazarus episode. They were discovered in 1895 by Joseph Wilpert, the Vatican's premier expert on catacomb art. This first one is from the Praetextus catacomb in Rome, and Wilpert categorizes it as the resurrection of Lazarus with the Samaritan woman. So you can see they both have Jesus talking to a lady. So here's the Samaritan woman, her well is down there. Sorry, I cut off the well there, but the well is there. And you can see here that there's steps going up. And so this, obviously Wilpert can't be totally certain that this is the raising of Lazarus, but the fact that it's right above Jesus talking to another woman, and here's another catacomb painting with the raising of Lazarus, no sisters, and you can see that we've got the steps there. So that is probably why Wilpert categorized it as the raising of Lazarus. This is a 3rd century painting. Now we also have another 3rd century painting from the Capella Greca of the Priscilla catacomb. Wilpert thought that there was only one sister in this painting. This is strange. And he writes that it's apparently Mary. There would have been no reason for him to omit the second sister in his description. So Kateusz writes that from Joseph Wilpert until 1970, everybody agreed that there was only one sister in the painting. But since 1970, scholars have always said that there are two sisters. So are there one or two in this fresco? Well, I got a grant from Villanova and I was able to go this summer with an Italian imaging firm, and we went with the Vatican Pontifical Commission for Sacred Archaeology, and we went to the Priscilla catacomb, and we conducted hyperspectral imaging. Pretty cool, right? And also some PXRS spectroscopy, which can figure out what the pigments are. And it seems that there are two sisters in all the detectable layers, right? You were expecting me to say one. I thought that there was going to be one also, but there are two. There are two. And there is a caveat. By the way, this reduces Kateusz's statistic. There are 95% of all 3rd and 4th century artwork has one sister. Okay. So, and some, the only 5% has two sisters. There are a couple of caveats. This strange round area between the male and female figures could be an erased hand of an orante. There's a lot of orantes, women with their hands like this praying in the catacombs. And there's also some other changes that we've seen in other layers. I had to ask permission from the ANAA, which is the Italian imaging firm, and also from the Vatican. And they said I could show you this one image, but we got many images that we're processing right now. And they will be published in a separate article. So they do show that there have been several changes made to this painting. So I'm going to say probably there are two sisters, because we couldn't quite detect any absence of a second sister, but we also can see that there have been changes made to the painting, but all the changes were made in antiquity. We did PXRF data, and it confirms that all the pigments are ancient. So if there was originally just an orante with a man, there's no way for us to know that, because everything that happened to this painting seemed to have been done in antiquity. So, but let's say it looks like there's two sisters there. So from these catacomb paintings of the Lazarus episode, we can cautiously surmise, and also, of course, from the sarcophagi, we can cautiously surmise that both one and two sister versions of the Lazarus scene were known in the 3rd century. Okay, perhaps that's unsurprising. Papyrus 66 is probably copied around the turn of the 3rd century, or maybe in the 3rd century. We have Origen's commentary on John, and he knows Martha in his commentary on John, which is 3rd century. But for whatever reason, the one sister depiction became most dominant in 4th century iconography. So yeah, that's just what dominates. I suggest that and it also actually continued for quite a while. You can see it as late as the 5th century, and even some later artwork that's styled on 5th century artwork. I think this Andrew's diptych is 9th century, but it's based on a 5th century copy. So I suggest that for several centuries, both one and two sister text forms of the Lazarus story were circulating simultaneously, resulting in textual mixture throughout the entire manuscript transmission, as well as confusion in the patristic record and also in the copies of the manuscript record, and the artwork being created in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and even later centuries. So we're getting very close to the end. I'm sure you're happy about that. I'm sorry it's so long, but there's a lot of stuff that is all quite relevant. So recommendations. I have recommendations. So some people in this room, does anybody here work on the CBGM? Holger. Holger works on the CBGM. Okay. So the CBGM can help us explore the question. When it comes to the Bethany sisters, I recommend that scholars working on the CBGM are looking for discrepancies around Mary and Martha in clusters of variants, not just individual variation units. Clusters of discrepancies may indicate that the exemplar's ancestor interacted at some point with a one-sister text form. Here's just one example, minuscules 157, 1344, 579, and 2680. They're all closely related genealogically in John. And you can see that 157 skips Martha's name in John 11:1. 1344 changes Maria to Martha in John 11:20. 579 uses singular verbs. And 2680 lists Mary first in John 11:5, omits Martha's name, and then uses a singular pronoun at 11:19. Obviously these are not the same variation unit, but they do all reflect inconsistency around Martha. Family 13 may also reflect some issues around the Bethany sisters. Minuscules 13, 69, 124, 346, and 788 all list Mary first in John 11:5, whereas other family 13 witnesses, 983, correction, 1344 before correction, and 1689, they say that Mary ran to Jesus in John 11:20. All of these witnesses say his sister in John 11:1. So I'm suggesting that whenever a high concentration of Maria-Martha problems are occurring in related witnesses in the CBGM, rather than assuming that these are scribal errors arising independently, please consider whether the ancestor might have interacted with a Martha-less text form. I should also mention that the demarcation of variation units matters. I spoke to Ulrich Schmid about this. If you say that the variation unit is tes adelphes autou without the woman's name, you're not going to see whether Maria's tes adelphes autou variants are related to one another. So the demarcation should start here. If you have the demarcation starting there, you might see that Papyrus 66 and Codex Alexandrinus are related. But if you put the demarcation here, you won't see it. So the demarcation of the variation units matters, especially in John 11:1. Okay. Conclusion. Isn't that a nice word to hear in a paper, a very long paper? Okay. No extant manuscript retains a text of John 11 where Martha is absent. And consequently, this thesis of a circulating one-sister text form of the Lazarus story remains speculative. Not unlike Q, this thesis is unprovable unless an authentic manuscript of John surfaces where Martha is wholly absent. However, in my view, there are 4 major takeaways that make this thesis viable. Here are the major takeaways. Oh, my S is down there. Sorry about that. Okay, so number 1, the fact that a reconstructed eclectic text form with real readings featuring only one sister matches the most common ancient artwork of the Lazarus story. The reconstruction matches the one sister artwork. That's the first one. Second of all, there is now a well-established Sitzenleben of a 2nd century conflict between the legacies of Peter and Mary, and that provides a motive for transferring Mary's Christological confession to a less controversial character. Number 3, there is obvious name confusion between Mary and Martha arising throughout the entire Greek transmission of John in gospel manuscripts and patristic commentators, but there is no equivalent in the Lukan transmission. Number 4, Johannine style better matches the one-sister text form, particularly regarding the order of names, who's listed in order in John 11:1 and 11:5. And secondly, John 11:40's possible connection to Jesus speaking about the glory of God in John 11:4. Of course, every one of the pieces of evidence I've given you today has multiple explanations. It's just that collectively, there are so many types of uncertainty found throughout the Johannine manuscript, patristic, and artistic record that can be explained by the interpolation of Martha. We should not ignore that we have three ancient mediums converging in their uncertainty around Martha: gospel manuscripts, patristic quotations, and early artwork. Is there anything else in antiquity? That's all that we have, right? So we must keep front and center that the legacy of a woman named Mary, who was sometimes thought to be Mary Magdalene, was hotly disputed in the first centuries of Christianity. Ancient apocryphal texts reflect memories of attempts to suppress Mary's prominence, and thus it is quite reasonable to consider whether those debates have left a mark upon our biblical text. Let us not forget that the site of Papyrus 66's discovery is only about 2 hours walk from Nag Hammadi. And I just thought about this last night when I was having dinner. Could Jesus' statement to Mary, "I am the resurrection and the life, those who believe in me will never die, but they will live," could that be connected to Peter's statement in the Gospel of Thomas 1:14, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life"? Could this be a reference to John 11:27? This ancient debate can go both directions. Jutkiewicz has demonstrated that sometimes Mary of Bethany's role was amplified. So perhaps all the manuscripts where Mary is featured more prominently, like where she's listed first in John 11:5, maybe these are communities where Mary was venerated. That may be one factor at play. Post may well be correct that at least some of the transcriptions are errors. That's another factor at play. Perhaps there's a bit of sexism going on as well. Perhaps all of these factors are at play. But it is not too big a leap to conclude that some ancient Christians changed their versions of the Johannine story, whether in homiletic fashion or in their gospel manuscripts, either to more prominently feature Mary or to diminish her. And so I do not think that I'm going to recommend a definitive Ausgangs text. I don't think we can necessarily arrive there. But confusion around the Bethany sisters is evident in the entire textual transmission in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and Ge'ez, and at least 5 different church fathers and mothers, and the ancient artistic record. So the question is, how should this be reflected in the apparatus of the nestle-aland 29th edition? You can turn over your handout. Here are my recommendations. The readings of John 11:1 and Papyrus 66 and Codex Alexandrinus should be indicated, since both of them lacked Martha in their initial transcription. The reading of John 11:3 and Papyrus 66 should reflect that we cannot be certain of the woman's name that was crossed out. NA27 said Maria, NA28 said Martha, and let's say we don't know. We can't be certain what her name is. The reading of John 11:5 should indicate that Mary is named first throughout many gospel manuscripts in Greek, Coptic, and Ge'ez. And it should also indicate that Lazarus is named first in many Old Latin witnesses with an equivalent in a Chrysostom homily that is in Greek. This might be due to sexism, as Fellows suggests, or it might be due to Johannine style, as I have suggested. So that honors both myself and Richard Fellows' contributions, if you list the ones where Lazarus is first. So, and if there's room, perhaps the apparatus can show that Mary serves in John 12:2 in several minuscules, as well as one Chrysostom homily. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
So much for your exciting.
I think it's exciting.
Yes, I think it's very exciting. I've learned much, and I have some new insights and doubts about what we should do.
Yes.
You make me think again.
Oh, good.
So and I will bring this to the editorial team of nestle-aland.
Yes, I recorded the whole thing, and so people can hear me talking.
They hear it. So I think it was a wonderful paper. It was not too long. It was too short. It was so wonderful, so interesting. I think all of us are astonished about all this material. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Are there some questions? but we are so.
Please challenge me. This is your chance. But what about this? You're
But
wrong.
we are too impressed really to say something. So we have to think days about this. But
Yes.
maybe there's something. What I've found very interesting is that what very often is what very often is not thought of in our discipline, the difference between scribes and editors. I think this is very, very important. We always hear in discussions, the scribes do this, the scribes do that. The scribes do not so much. If this was really happening, what you said, it's not a work of the scribe. It's a work of a redactor. And I think this is very important to see the difference between scribes and editors. So very often you hear this, scribes are doing anything. So scribes are thinking about, no, scribes are not thinking about it. Scribes are making mistakes in writing, but an editor, someone who has to think. And this if this is true, then there can only be an editor. There's someone who thought, and I think I was very, very impressed by your reconstruction of how it happened on the page. How it happened.
Graph of the Ausgangs text.
Yeah,
I don't know.
But I think it's an amazing, very interesting hypothesis that you could. So I was very, very amazed about this. I think I've learned much, and we have learned much, and we will discuss it later on in the next months.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you for being here.
Thank you.
It was a great honor for us to be what we have here heard. This is research, living research. We were witnesses of something new happening. So thank you very much.
Oh, it is my pleasure. Thank you, Holger. And thank you for letting me speak to you in English. I apologize. I'm not yet good enough at German to lecture in German. Maybe someday. Thank you.